Okay, let's dive right in. 603,550 men. That number, I mean, it just leaps off the page in Numbers chapter 1. It's from that census right after the Exodus.
It really does. And what's striking, is that it's not just a one-off figure.
Right.
We see something similar, about 600,000 men when they actually leave Egypt in Exodus.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Then there's the silver collected for the tabernacle, also in Exodus. The count of men over 20 who paid that half-shekel tax, it comes out to exactly 603,550.
Exactly. Wow.
Exactly. And then, fast forward 40 years, end of the wilderness wanderings, there's another census in Numbers. And that total is 601,730. Still huge and incredibly close.
So yeah, these massive numbers keep showing up. It really begs the question, what are we supposed to make of them?
That's the core issue.
So for this deep dive, we're tackling these Israelite population figures head on. The Exodus, the wilderness wanderings, but really focusing on that first big count, the 603,550 from Numbers 1.46. We're using that Numbers census figure discrepancy document you provided as our guide. And our mission today really is to unpack these numbers, the debates around them, especially the language, but keep it, accessible, not too academic.
Absolutely. And the central puzzle is this. Are we looking at a literal head count? Over 500,000 men, meaning maybe 2 million people total, maybe more.
A huge population.
Or could the key Hebrew word here, Eleph, mean something else in this specific context, like maybe a clan or military unit, which would give us a much smaller group?
Right. That's the crux of it. Massive nation or a more manageable group. So let's start with the texts themselves. What do these census accounts actually say?
Okay, so the first big one, Numbers chapter 1. This happens in the second year after leaving Egypt. The purpose is stated very clearly. Count the men, 20 years and older, who are able to go to war.
Military census, basically.
Exactly. Moses is told to do it tribe by tribe, based on their families, their ancestral houses.
And the details are pretty specific, aren't they? I remember looking at the list. Reuben, Simeon, Gad.
Yeah.
They all have these large, precise-looking numbers.
Very precise. Reuben, 46,500. Simeon, 59,300. Gad, 45,650. It goes on like that for all 12 tribes, minus the Levites, who are counted separately for tabernacle duties.
And when you add all those up,
you get exactly 603,550 men. It definitely gives the impression of a careful, specific tally.
Yeah, it feels very official, very exact.
It does. And that precision is, well, it's a cornerstone for the literal interpretation, but your source document points out something interesting too.
Oh, yeah.
Within those individual tribal numbers, there's a noticeable tendency for them to end in 50 or 0. Like, they seem rounded to the nearest 50 or 100 quite often.
Huh. So maybe some estimation or rounding at the tribal level, even if the grand total looks super precise?
It's a possibility some scholars raise, like maybe administrative rounding was happening. It adds a little wrinkle.
Okay, that is interesting. Now, what about that Exodus departure number? Exodus 12.37 says about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. That word, about, feels different.
It does feel different, less precise, certainly. About likely signals, general order of magnitude. It tells you this was a huge crowd, a vast multitude leaving Egypt.
So more narrative description than strict accounting.
Possibly. Describing the sheer scale of the event, maybe, compared to Numbers 1, which feels much more like an administrative or military roster, a specific count for a specific purpose.
Okay, so a general sense of lots of people leaving, then a very specific number later. But then we get to Exodus 38, the tabernacle ransom. That seemed to pull us back towards the specific number, doesn't it?
It really does. That's a tough one for non-literal views. Every man 20 and older pays a half shekel. The text explicitly states the total silver collected 100 talents and 1,775 shekels.
Okay.
And if you calculate how many half shekels that represents, it comes out to exactly 603,550 men.
Wow. The math lines up perfectly with the Numbers 1 census.
Perfectly. It creates this direct link between a specific financial transaction, an individual tax, and that exact population figure. So the question becomes, how does a clan or unit idea work if each individual paid this tax, adding up to that number?
Yeah, that's a definite challenge for the non-literal interpretation. It seems to point towards counting actual individuals.
It's a strong piece of evidence for the literal side, no doubt.
And then, nearly 40 years later, Numbers 26, another census, right where they enter Canaan. And And the number is 600 and the 1,730. Again, huge and really close to the first one.
Yes, remarkably close. That small decrease, maybe around 1,800 men, is sometimes seen theologically perhaps reflecting God's judgment on the generation that died in the wilderness. Or, from a more critical standpoint, some scholars find the consistency itself a bit suspicious. After 40 years of hardship, disease, battles, for the number to remain so stable seems almost, well, too neat for some.
Right, depends on your starting point, I guess. But the texts consistently give us these very large numbers.
Okay, let's pivot to the linguistic angle, because this seems key. The Hebrew word Eleph, it usually means 1,000, but not always.
Exactly. That's the crucial point. While 1,000 is its primary meaning, Eleph has a broader semantic range in biblical Hebrew. It can also mean clan, family, group, even a military unit or squad.
Okay, so it's not just one simple meaning. Can you give some examples? Where else does it mean something other than 1,000?
Sure. Your source mentions a few good ones. Like in Judges 6, Gideon says his alpai, that's a form of Eleph, is the weakest in his tribe. He clearly means his clan or family, not that he commands a literal 1,000 men.
Okay, that makes sense contextually.
Or Micah 5, talking about Bethlehem being too small to be among the alpai of Judah, the clans or divisions of the tribe. And there's a related word, Aluf, from the same root letters, which means chief or leader, like the chiefs of Edom listed in Genesis 36.
So the same letters, Elp, could be understood differently. Precisely. And remember, early Hebrew writing didn't have vowels marked consistently.
Right, no vowel points back then.
So the pronunciation, and thus the meaning derived from those consonants GIL-P, really depended heavily on context. We have to reconstruct that sometimes. Context is everything. Think about 1 Kings 20, where you get these accounts of battles with huge numbers of casualties that seem almost unbelievable if taken as precise figures.
So maybe sometimes large numbers are used more broadly.
It's possible. Which brings us back to numbers. How is Eleph working there in those census lists? This is where that clan unit idea really takes off.
Explain that again. How does it work?
The hypothesis is that when a list says, for example, the tribe of Reuben had 46 Eleph and 500, it might not mean 46,000 plus 500. It might mean 46 units or clans plus 500 individual men.
Okay, so you'd have groups and individuals counted separately within each tribe's total.
Exactly. And if you apply that logic across all the tribes, the total population drops dramatically. Your source mentions one reconstruction ending up with something like 598 total units, plus around 5,500 additional men for all Israel.
Wow, that's a completely different scale. We're talking maybe tens of thousands total, not millions.
A massive difference. And of course, a smaller population like that would certainly make the logistics of surviving in the Sinai desert seem, well, more feasible.
It definitely tackles the how did they eat and drink question more easily. But there's pushback on this Eleph as unit idea, right? From scholars like Gleason Archer.
Yes, there's a significant counter-argument based on grammar. Archer and others point out the very consistent structure of the census lists.
What about the structure?
It consistently follows the pattern. Number plus Eleph, 1,000 in it, plus number plus Mia, hundreds, plus number plus smaller units. It reads like a standard numerical breakdown, like us saying 46,500. The argument is, if Eleph meant clan here, why use this consistent descending numerical syntax? Wouldn't you expect different phrasing? Maybe something like 46 clans of Reuben and also 500 men? The grammar itself seems to reinforce Eleph being used in its numerical sense of 1,000 in these specific lists.
So the way it's written looks like they're counting thousands, then hundreds, then tens and ones.
That's the argument. It's not just about the possible meanings of Eleph elsewhere, but how it functions grammatically within these specific census passages. So you've got this linguistic possibility, but also a strong grammatical pattern pointing the other way.
Which leads us right into the big debate. Literal versus non-literal interpretation.
Exactly. It's a spectrum, really.
Okay, let's lay out the arguments first for taking it literally. Around 600,000 men, maybe 2 million or more people total. What's the core case for that?
Well, as we've touched on, textual consistency is huge. That match between numbers 1 and the Exodus 38 tax count is powerful.
The silver tax, yeah.
The fact that adding up the tribal numbers in numbers 1, using Eleph as 1,000, gives you the stated total. And the closeness to the numbers 26 census 40 years later, there's a lot of internal numerical agreement in the text itself.
Feels deliberate.
It does. Then there are theological arguments. A huge number magnifies God's power. Look how many people he rescued. Look how he provided. It emphasizes the fulfillment of the promises to Abraham about descendants becoming a great nation. It shows God's detailed organization and care for this vast community.
Okay. And how do they address the practical problems, like feeding everyone in the desert?
Often by pointing to God's miraculous provision, the manna, the water from the rock. If God is intervening supernaturally, then sustaining millions isn't necessarily harder than sustaining thousands.
Fair point from that perspective. What about the lack of archaeological evidence?
The argument there is usually that nomadic peoples just don't leave much behind. A massive group moving for 40 years wouldn't necessarily build cities or leave easily detectable traces, especially in Sinai.
Okay. And the rapid population growth needed.
They'd argue divine blessing, perhaps unusually high fertility rates in Egypt, as the text suggests they were fruitful. Some calculations propose it's demographically possible, though maybe requiring optimal conditions or a slightly longer timeline. And often, this view aligns with a strong belief in Mosaic authorship and the text's complete historical accuracy.
So for the literal view, the text says it, the numbers connect internally, and it highlights God's immense power and faithfulness to his promises.
That's a good summary. The sheer scale is part of the message.
Right. Now let's flip to the arguments for non-literal interpretations aiming for smaller population figures.
This is where the Eleph as unit hypothesis becomes really important for many scholars.
Right. The clans or troops idea.
Yes. If Eleph means unit, you get totals in the tens of thousands, like the figures proposed by Wenham or Humphreys or Hoffmeyer. The big appeal here is logistical feasibility.
Makes more sense in the desert.
Exactly. Feeding, watering, organizing, moving tens of thousands is challenging, but seems far more plausible in the Sinai environment than managing millions.
And the archaeology fits better.
Well, the lack of widespread evidence for a massive population fits better. Again, nomads are hard to track, but the footprint expected from millions is just vast. A smaller group aligns better with the limited findings, or lack thereof.
You also mentioned it resolves some internal biblical issues, like the firstborn count.
Yes, exactly. In Numbers 3, there's a count of about 22,000 firstborn males. If you have over 600,000 adult men, the ratio of firstborns seems incredibly low. It implies families were enormous on average. With a smaller total population, that firstborn ratio becomes much more demographically normal.
Okay, that's interesting. And military size.
A fighting force of 600,000 Israelites would dwarf the known armies of major powers like Egypt at that time. Think of the Battle of Kadesh, maybe 25,000 Egyptians. An Israelite army in the tens of thousands fits much better within the known military landscape of the ancient Near East.
So the unit interpretation seems to solve several practical and comparative problems.
It does offer solutions to those challenges. It suggests a God working powerfully, but perhaps through a group whose size was more in line with other nations of the time.
But the unit idea isn't the only non-literal approach, is it?
No, definitely not. Some scholars, like Sarna, suggest the numbers might be symbolic or typological, not meant as exact counts, but used to convey theological truths, the grandeur of God's salvation, the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise in a conceptual way.
So emphasizing the idea of multitude rather than the precise number.
Exactly. Others propose the numbers could be anachronistic, meaning they reflect the population of Israel from a later period, maybe the monarchy, and were sort of read back into the Exodus story.
Projecting later realities onto the past.
That's the idea. And some, like Wenham again, also acknowledge the possibility of scribal errors during the long process of copying these texts over centuries. Large numbers are particularly prone to corruption.
So we have unit interpretation, symbolic numbers, anachronism, potential errors, quite a few ways to arrive at a smaller figure.
Yes, using different lines of reasoning. Traditional Jewish commentators, by the way, often lean towards the literal interpretation.
Good point. Okay, so stepping outside the text itself for a moment. History and archaeology, what's the broader picture?
As we've said, the Sinai archaeology is sparse concerning evidence for a massive, long-term encampment during the Late Bronze Age. It doesn't disprove the Exodus, but it doesn't support the multi-million figure easily.
And in Canaan, where they end up.
The picture of the conquest is complex archaeologically. It doesn't necessarily show a sudden, overwhelming influx of millions. And then you have that Egyptian Merneptah still, around 1207 BCE. It mentions Israel as a people group in Canaan.
That's significant external proof.
It is, but the context might suggest Israel is one people among others, perhaps not yet the dominant force implied by a recent arrival of 600,000 warriors. It's debated, of course.
And comparing Israel to other ancient societies, you mentioned army sizes.
Right. The 600,000 figure makes Israel's army exceptionally large compared to contemporary forces, like Egypt's army at Kadesh. It positions them as a military superpower right out of the gate, which doesn't quite fit the narrative arc of gradual establishment in Canaan.
What about just general population density back then?
Estimates for ancient cities and regions suggest that concentrating over 2 million people into one migrating group would be extraordinary, potentially straining the resources and social structures known for that era. And as mentioned, some scholars point to literary conventions in the ancient Near East, where large numbers were sometimes used for rhetorical or symbolic effect, not always literal precision.
So the external data seems to lean towards creating challenges for the literal high numbers.
It often presents challenges, yes, which is why many scholars look for alternative interpretations. And that brings us back to the population growth question, too.
Getting from Jacob's family of 70 to over 2 million in, a few centuries in Egypt.
Exactly. Whether you use the traditional 430 years or the shorter 215 years some argue for based on genealogies, the required annual growth rate is quite high, maybe around 2.1% for the longer period.
Is that plausible?
Proponents of the literal view say yes, citing divine blessing and maybe favorable conditions. But it's a faster growth rate than observed in many pre-industrial societies, and faster than Israel's apparent growth later in Canaan. It's another piece of the puzzle that adds to the debate.
Okay, so pulling this all together, the different interpretations, literal or smaller numbers, they must have different theological implications too, right? How does the number affect the meaning?
It can shape the emphasis, certainly. Taking the numbers literally really magnifies God's raw power, the sheer scale of his miraculous intervention and faithfulness to the promise of multitude. It underscores the divine order needed to manage such a vast nation.
Big numbers, big God.
In a sense. On the other hand, interpreting the numbers as pointing to a smaller group might highlight God's power working through apparent weakness, his ability to form a people and achieve his purposes without overwhelming force. It might emphasize a more gradual fulfillment of the promises, and for some, it resolves potential logistical or even ethical difficulties found in some wilderness narratives if you imagine millions involved.
So different ways of understanding God's power and how he works with Israel.
Yes, but it's really important to stress that many of the core theological messages remain intact either way.
Like what?
Things like God's grace in choosing and redeeming Israel, the covenant relationship, the giving of the law, the importance of faith and obedience, the consequences of disobedience, God's ongoing provision and presence. These central themes resonate whether you envision 2 million people or, say, 50,000.
Yeah.
The debate over the census figures doesn't necessarily overturn the foundational theology of Exodus and Numbers.
That's a crucial point. The main story doesn't entirely hinge on the exact count.
For many readers, no.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The census accounts, the Eleph puzzle, the arguments for literal and non-literal views, the archaeological context, the theological reflections. It really boils down to this tension, doesn't it, between the text's explicit large numbers and the questions raised by logistics, archaeology, linguistics.
That's it exactly. It's a tension between the face value reading and the various challenges that arise when you dig deeper or look at it from different angles. There's no single easy answer that satisfies everyone, which is why the discussion continues.
So for you listening to this, we hope this deep dive has maybe shed some light on why this is such a persistent question in biblical studies. It shows how complex interpreting ancient texts can be.
Absolutely. And wrestling with this numbers problem, it gives you real insight into the process of interpretation itself, weighing different kinds of evidence, considering literary context, historical context, linguistic possibilities. It's a great case study.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. How does thinking about these different possibilities, the massive nation versus the smaller group, shape your picture of God's relationship with Israel during the exit and wilderness times? Is the sheer scale the main point for you, emphasizing God's might? Or is the act of forming a people, regardless of the exact number, that speaks more powerfully about covenant and faithfulness what stands out to you now, having heard the different sides of the debate?